Is there such a thing as leadership in business? Or is it a manufactured concept to sell business books and executive education at big-name business schools?
This is the Value Creators Podcast. Value creation is the sole purpose of any business and every business, and for all of us as entrepreneurs. Listen to great value creators as they share their successes, trials, and lessons learned. Join us as we explore how to think as value creators, how to act as value creators, and how to view business through the lens of value creation.
Here at the Value Creators, we're a bit skeptical about the concept of leadership in business. It doesn't present itself as a serious economic function. So the idea of the great man or the great woman leading change in business, as opposed to it emerging as a result of a creative or systemic process, just seems contrived to us. But Adam Bryant wants us to think differently. He says that both can be true. Individuals can emerge as leaders as a result of individual experience or the needs of the team system or the grinding of the corporate machine. But once they do emerge, they can make positive contributions in decision-making and leading improvements. We'll learn that Adam is a real expert in this field of business leadership. He didn't develop his opinions in the confines of a university. He interviewed thousands of leaders in thousands of business settings to develop real experience about how leadership actually takes place in the real world. He's someone genuinely to be followed in this field. Adam, welcome to the Value Creators Podcast.
Thanks so much, Hunter.
You're an expert on leadership in business, which is our subject today. And I say expert not lightly because you've amassed an incredible history and a database. You've interviewed over 1,000 CEOs and business leaders. You've analyzed the data. You've written about it in your column in the New York Times and your LinkedIn series. So you really are a true expert, and you'll give us some great insights today. We're going to ask, as economists, what is the economic role of leadership? And is there really an economic role? So we think in structures like the capitalist who owns the resources and puts them to work, the entrepreneur who decides how to allocate those resources to create more value, the managers to whom the entrepreneur delegates the authority to run those plans every day. There's nothing in an economic textbook about leadership. And so that's what we're going to think about today. So maybe we can start with your definition of leadership in business, Adam. How would you define it for us?
Sure. And just to pick up kind of where you are and sort of meet you halfway, I mean, I do think a lot of leaders share a lot of DNA with entrepreneurs. And I think the shared DNA is a habit of mind that looks for and sees the possible and sees what is missing, looks at the world and sees the gaps, the opportunities, the points of tension, rather than just seeing things for what they are or doing what somebody else told them to do. They just have this mindset where they're looking for opportunities and always asking what could be rather than what is.
We'd probably allocate that within entrepreneurship because that's the search for new solutions and new opportunities. But let me dig into some of the early parts of your book, which I should have mentioned. You've written a book called The Leap to Leadership, and you include a lot of interviews in there and helps people understand how to be leaders in business. So a couple of things you say. It's a decision-making role. It's the one that makes the hardest decisions. That's one of the things you say. It's a lightning rod role because by making those decisions, you've also got to be fully accountable and take any blame if that's what's allocated. And it's a role model for others in being able to make those decisions and take the risks if you're out on a limb. So is that a place to start? It's a decision-making role where the decisions are hard?
Yeah, happy to start there. And I do think it is a key differentiator and a requirement of leadership, because when you are in a leadership position, usually the decisions are hard, right? There's not a lot of data that, in this day and age, there's this sort of initial impulse, well, give me the analytics to make the decision. But the fact of the matter is, the higher you go, the more gray areas there are. And if you are indeed looking at sort of a new problem set, there's not going to be necessarily analytics or data media. And so part of it is just being comfortable with making kind of gut calls. And if you ask, what does gut call mean? It's not just how you feel that day or what you ate for breakfast. It means based on your sort of sum total of experience, your pattern recognition. So I think it requires a level of comfort to be able to make decisions in the absence of clear data that points to one way being the right way over the other. And I think it also requires some courage and frankly, a thick skin to know that your decision might not be popular. Right? Leadership is not a popularity contest. You have to do what is best for the organization and know that your tough call is going to upset some people. And just that point alone, I think we have to sort of acknowledge that in the last few years, with the rise of stakeholder capitalism, that people feel much more emboldened to share their opinion, both within the company and on social media. So as a leader, you have to be prepared for people to disagree with you and be quite vocal about that. But just know that internally that you are doing what is best for the organization. And I think if you use that as your compass, as your sailboat centerboard, if you will, to choose another metaphor, I think you can kind of rest easy at night that you are fulfilling your duty as a leader.
Well, a couple of things there, Adam. I think that paints a great picture. So there's some rarity value there, right? Not everybody can do that. You mentioned gut feel, which we actually elevate to a very high level. We think a lot of decisions are subjective. You're weighing a lot of things that could include data, as you said, and analytics. But boy, that's not all of it, because you're dealing with human beings, both your customers and your fellow employees. We call that judgment, the ability to make subjective decisions. Have you found some people better able to do that, or there's a way to learn to do it? How do you get to be good at judgment?
I think the experience is the best teacher. And I think the more you do it, the more you develop that sense of judgment. You get enough your own kind of data set of experience. And what I find really interesting about leadership positions, I think the higher you go, that you're sort of, in effect, the intensity of your lived experience increases, because you have more than just your own personal lived experience. I tried this. Did it work? Did it not work? What did I learn from that? But as the higher up you go, you get to see more examples, mini case studies. I'm watching these individuals operate, and I'm noticing patterns of the ones that are successful versus others. I'm noticing some teams are more successful than others. I'm seeing all these different initiatives that are being started where we're allocating resources to them. We can call that strategy. We can call those bets, which I kind of prefer to call them. But you make enough bets, and then if you take the time to process whether there is insight there, that ideally you become like the human equivalent of machine learning, that you always are processing, looking for the patterns. And I think ultimately that informs your gut. And I know to have somebody's got a good gut, like, sounds very intangible and amorphous. But to me, it is the sum total of experience. But it's experience plus, because some people go through life experiencing things, but they don't necessarily process it. And I do like metaphors. And I think there are some people who take their experience, which is kind of like a wet towel, if you will, and then just literally wring it and wring it and wring it and get every last drop of insight they can from that experience. I think that's the thing that really separates people.
Yeah, it's a fascinating metaphor. I'm thinking about mental models as an alternative to metaphor. So the mental model of wringing a towel of experience for everything that's in it. I can use that. So there's time here. You talk about accumulating experience. That takes some time. One of the interesting distinctions you make in the book, Adam, is you can spend that time climbing the ladder in business to a position of authority where you can exert leadership. But you recommend better is looking at breadth rather than height, getting more and more different experiences and accumulating the experience that way, as opposed to getting a bigger title or a promotion. Tell us about that. What's your thinking and how did you come by it?
Sure. Well, I find I talk to a lot of college graduates and spend time in universities and talking to college grads, and just in working with 20 somethings, I have noticed that people in that generation, they're planners. They often make very explicit and detailed plans for their careers that go something like, by this age, I want to be making this much money and I want to have this title. And then by 5 years later, I want to be making this much money and having this title. When you get a few gray hairs like you and I do, and look back on your career, you realize that life doesn't really work that way. And that if you are going to be sort of overly planful in your career, it's probably going to lead to frustration, right? Because if you go into a company and say, well, I want this title and I want to be doing that, but the company says, we actually think you'd be great doing something over here. We think this is a great opportunity for you. But if you go into those conversations and into your career with almost blinders on, it's like, this is what I want, and I've got to rise straight up the ladder, I think it's going to lead to a lot of frustration on all sides. So I think it's a much better mindset to go into a job with a simple idea like, I want to learn as much as I can. And to use another metaphor, I mean, imagine the pyramid. Like, pyramids have really wide bases, right? And so they're very solid. And you need to, in the early stages, like, build as wide a base in your career as you can. And you get that through doing different experiences. So just having this kind of open mind to new opportunities, because your boss may come to you and say, you've done great in this. We think you do great over here. And this is a tough problem and nobody's really been able to crack it, but we really think you can. That may have nothing to do with anything you've ever done or imagined yourself doing. But you do that, that could set you off in some amazing trajectory of your career. So I think it's this idea of just looking for, to me, there's a world of difference between looking for opportunities to move up rather than just looking to move up. Because the latter is people who are very title focused. It's like, I just want to get this title. And they're sort of demanding of their bosses. Companies love people who there's an appropriate amount of contentment and ambition, right? Contentment in that I am fully focused on the job that I'm doing right now, and I'm going to do an amazing job. At some point, we're going to talk about what I want to do next, but I am mostly focused on doing this job really well. And that's the fastest way to get promoted, is to not ask for one, is to do such a good job in what you're doing now. People are just going to be beating down doors to like give you more responsibility. So I just think people need to really like take off the blinders, widen their aperture to mix metaphors, and just see their careers as just a series of great learning opportunities and opportunities to do a great job. And that's going to get you promoted.
Yeah, I remember my days in corporate, Adam, and the counter to that was they made you think up or out. If you're not the first one promoted in your cohort, then you better think about leaving because you're not the guy. That created internal competitiveness and it wasn't productive, I don't think. Your advice is a lot better than that. Do you think corporations are thinking that way?
I think increasingly so, because I think the model that you are describing, it was in a different era where corporations are kind of based on the military model, right? Everything was very vertical, command and control. Companies were organized around functions and silos, and they get these ideas that I just think the world has just sort of exploded into ambiguity and uncertainty and blurry lines. And you add on top of that the fact that we've just been through the Great Resignation, and companies are really fighting hard to keep the best talent, finding new opportunities for them, making sure they're feeling excited about where they are. You're still going to find some companies that do what you described, but I think they're more laggards than forward-looking.
Maybe we should get rid of the whole concept of promotion. Well, really, in a networked economy, right, where everything's horizontal, it's sharing knowledge, titles are not relevant.
Listen, over the years, I've interviewed a few CEOs who got so fed up with the sort of title focus and title creep that they went into their companies and said, we're getting rid of titles, no more titles. You're going to have like 5 different, like your client focused or this and that. Human beings are so motivated by these external status markers, whether it's the size of office or your title or all these things. And we know that from research too, like people are like crazily focused on status markers, and they can have this distortive effect about how people think about their careers.
Yeah, there's economics for that, Adam. It's all value is relative. It's only valuable to me if I can compare it with yours and have more than you do.
quick story, like we all have stories, we've seen this in action, but like to me, I've seen the movie where somebody got a chief of staff in the company and suddenly like, why don't I have a chief of staff? And so proliferation of chiefs of staff. Or there was a day where people in the graphics department had 2 monitors, but then somebody got a 3rd monitor and it's like, you have 3 monitors? How come I only have 2? And suddenly everybody had 3 monitors. So
Yeah, you do say that in the book. Don't chase status, chase achievement, which was lovely. Word that you mentioned that we'll just spend some time on is problem solving. Leaders are good at solving problems. We always think that there's a step before that, and that is having a problem mindset, recognizing that there are problems. Nothing's perfect. We've got to do error correction. Wherever we are, we've got to get better. Is that part of a leader's mindset, recognizing problems and not trying to pull them under the rug?
certainly, and being sort of brutally honest with yourself as an individual, and also being brutally honest about where the company is at. In the work that I'm doing in this chapter of my career as a consultant going into big companies, that I think one of the challenges for companies, to borrow a phrase from one of the CEOs I interviewed, was that they don't want to look in the ugly mirror. They'd rather be cheerleaders for themselves. But it's important for every company to be brutally honest with itself about what the challenges are, because then you can't sort of say, okay, let's have a reality check on where we are now and let's agree status quo is not an option, to get people motivated on some kind of future focus. So I think being honest about the problems is one thing, but to me, a key habit of mine for leaders is the ability to simplify complexity. And, maybe you add a beat before that of sort of being able to spot the problems and then start questioning them. But there is, by now I've interviewed more than 1,000 leaders that you said at the top of the interview, and from all different backgrounds. I've really tried to embrace diversity in every sense of the word. But I think that one of the threads that runs through them all is this habit of mind. They are able to simplify complexity within the world, within their industry, within the company, boil it down, create these kind of mental models that are simple enough that they can stand up on a stage at an all hands meeting and answer, to me, the kind of questions that little kids ask in the back seat, like, where are we going? How are we going to get there? Right? It's got to be simple enough. And that ability to take that complexity, say, here's how we're going to win, everybody. We're going to win by focusing on these 3 things, because I have seen too many leaders over the years in those kind of settings where they'll say, I've got 11 things on my mind right now. And you can literally feel the energy drain out of the room, because you and I know most people can't, and all the science shows this, but most people can't remember more than 3 things day to day, maybe 4.
3 for me, maybe. That's a fascinating idea, simplifying complexity. First, recognizing the world is complex. I mean, we talk about complex adaptive systems, and that's a hard issue to get your head around. But you use 2 terms there, focus. You distill it down into 2 or 3 things. The other one you use is mental models. That's kind of your metaphors as well. I think Charlie Munger, I don't know whether you've interviewed him, he was the one who introduced that concept, right? You've got to have 100 mental models and lattice them together, and that's how you run the world.
Yeah, and I have not interviewed him, but I did learn that secondhand through him. I think it's good to keep in mind, because it's the first step you have to do is build the mental model. Like, how are we going to win in the marketplace, right? And it's like, this is a strategy, this is how we're going to do it, these are the challenges, these are the scoreboard. Like, to me, that's a realistic strategy conversation. So it's one thing to build the mental model, but then I think it's just this constant process, especially in this day and age, of pressure testing the model, right? There's new data coming in every single moment about how the world is changing, consumers are changing, customers, suppliers, et cetera. And so you always have to be asking yourself, does this mental model still hold? Not that I'm going to throw it out, but does it need to be adjusted? And to me, so it's first simplify complexity, build that mental model, communicate the heck out of it, because most people don't know that there's no such thing as over communication. They say, why do I need to say it again? So build the mental model, simplify complexity, communicate the heck out of it, but then to yourself and ideally with your leadership team, always be questioning, like, does this still work? You don't want to pivot every single day like you were sort of a week-old startup and say, oh no, we need to pivot. Like, you don't want to do that. But you should have the mental discipline of being brutally honest and saying, is this still right? Do we need to make adjustments?
So let me take another tack here. You believe very strongly in individualism. When you interview your leaders, you ask them about their childhood growing up and you try and figure out their individual DNA. That kind of suggests that leadership is a personality based. It's not something you can teach in business school. Is that a fair conclusion to draw from the way that you look at it?
I think it's an and proposition, not an or. I think there is some wiring that we're born with, energy levels and things like that. I do think leadership as a skill can be taught. I think you can and what I try to do in my books is say, these are the things that really matter in leadership, and maybe we can learn from other leaders about these tactical approaches to how to do them. But the thing that I have over the years been really intrigued by in my interviews is I'm trying to understand where their drive comes from. Because I think if you write down the job description for a CEO or a C-suite leader, they're kind of crazy jobs, right? Unless you're like totally focused on money, the jobs are, they were crazy before the pandemic, and I can make an argument why they're 5 to 10 times harder now. So on paper, it does not make sense why anybody would want these jobs, right? The weight on your back 24/7, the personal sacrifices you have to make, et cetera, et cetera. So then you step back and say, okay, so why do people do these jobs? And I'm the first to admit that my research process, if you will, is not scientific. It wouldn't hold up to any kind of peer review. But I will say that I have interviewed more than 1,000 leaders, which represents roughly 8 million words of transcripts. And my informal sort of data set suggests that there's like a handful of categories that helps answer that question of where does their drive come from. The first one for me is that they faced a lot of adversity when they were younger. And I'm not going to try and overly shrink anybody, but when you face a lot of adversity, sometimes people get knocked down and they stay down, right? Other people get knocked down and they get back up. And they might also want to have some more control over their lives, right? If you grew up in a family with an abusive parent or an alcoholic parent or something like that, or financial adversity, maybe you were 8 years old in a comfortable middle-class life and your mother stayed at home and your father worked and he died of a heart attack. And guess what? There's no life insurance policy. And suddenly everybody in the family is scrambling to just keep the lights on. I've interviewed leaders who have had those experiences, and often they'll say the exact same thing to me, which is, I never wanted to put my own family in that position. So there's that sort of motivation, extra motivation to sort of go and be above and beyond, to put in those 20-hour days. That's one category. I mean, a couple of others. Another one is some version of kind of the immigrant story, and whether they're by definition an immigrant, but just this mindset that you are the first in your family to always be doing something, the first in your family to go to college, the first to do this, the first to do this. And I think that when you're always doing something for the first time, and there's no sort of familial knowledge or guidance they can give you, when you're always figuring out how to do something yourself for the first time, the harder path of leadership starts feeling like the only path, and you get comfortable on that path. So I think that's another bucket. A couple more, just like people who hit the parent lottery, right? They've got amazing parents, great childhoods. They've got this interesting like yin and yang of DNA with like an entrepreneur father and a psychologist mother. So they get the business smarts and the EQ, or the engineer father and the artist mother, or vice versa. I've heard a lot of those stories. And I think some people, they're just born with an incredible like internal metronome of energy. They just have so much energy, natural energy. I think the skin is there to contain that volcano, and that business just becomes a focus of that, like let's do a lot. So that's my completely informal, not able to be peer reviewed research.
No, it's brilliant. Firstly, don't let them tell you it's not scientific, Adam. We believe that deep, rich, qualitative data like that is far superior to any analytics or numbers based, because these people are human beings. As you said, they're all individuals, have had different experiences, and that's how they've emerged from those experiences. So don't ever say that again. That's perfectly scientific.
It's better if you say it than I say it.
It can come in different ways. So I made notes. You said adversity, fight against adversity. You talked about having to be a discovery, which is, no one's done it before. You've got to discover it yourself, or luck in the parental lottery, which are all fine. So I think, you can't standardize, you can't teach that. That's an emergent property of growing up. You do have a concept which I'd never seen before to kind of describe what some of these leaders do. You call it the agility quotient. So now we're getting close to economics. We believe in agility as a corporate capability to use feedback and make changes quickly to respond to a changing marketplace. You're applying it to a person. What do you find about the agility quotient at the individual level?
For context, I'll make the point that one of the colleagues at our firm, he observed about a year into the pandemic that the 21st century actually started in March of 2020, that was such a break point, and that the previous century lasted a couple of decades longer. Since the pandemic started, I mean, it feels like there's just so much acceleration and disruption and uncertainty and unknowables. And every week there's some crazy new headline about something, the once in a century event that seems to be coming every couple of years now. And I think the old framework we used to use of like IQ and EQ for emotional quotient or emotional intelligence, I think people feel like that's just not enough anymore. And so you see people coming up with these new labels. And one of the executives I interviewed introduced me to this idea of agility quotient. And it really resonated because I think it's just like, how comfortable are you in all that uncertainty, in all that gray area, especially these leadership jobs now. Again, at this point, I'm playing to type with my metaphors, but it must feel like, especially, can you imagine being like the head of HR at a big company? Because this has been HR's crisis. Like the 2008 crisis was the CFO's crisis. But everything that's happened in the last few years on the leadership team, the CHRO, Chief Human Resource Officer, has been at the center of everything. Right. So can you imagine being that person? You don't have any background in ventilation or medicine or vaccines or all these things. You set a new policy and a week later you have to change it. I have to think that those jobs feel like every day somebody is handing you a brand new Rubik's Cube that you have never seen before. Okay, solve this. Oh, and by the way, as soon as you're done solving this one you've never seen before, there's literally a mountain of them behind me that are coming to you like every single day. I'm going to hand you at least one more. And I feel like this moment has really separated people, that either you get excited by that or you're just like, I'm out. Like this is more than I wanted or am happy with. And I find the prospect of this mountain of Rubik's Cubes like really draining and demotivating. But I've interviewed a lot of leaders who just say, what an exciting time to be in a leadership position, right? So to me, it's like the agility quotient is another way of getting at that, but just like you're excited by the uncertainty and you see it as an opportunity rather than a burden.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight, the being excited by uncertainty. There's an economic concept for you, uncertainty. But you also said, or maybe it's just another metaphor for the same thing, they like to play in traffic. Which is a great line. That's a great visual.
Yeah.
And maybe you're going to get bumped a few times, right? But you're going to cross the road.
Yeah, and it's the metaphor for career advice, and came from a CEO by the name of Joe Plumeri, who I interviewed, I think, back in 2009, but has stayed with me ever since. But he told a couple of personal stories about these completely serendipitous moments that turned into like these pivotal moments in his career just because he showed up. And so he boils it down to this wonderful career advice, which is play in traffic, like do stuff, get out there, meet people, get involved, join committees in your organization. Because I always say to people, like, your career path is going to be determined so much more by the people you meet and work with and impress, and they want to bring you along for their next journey, than it is about your career plans. So I think you can never go wrong by playing in traffic.
Trying to get to the point where we can merge economics and leadership here. This idea of being agile, constantly changing, being able to take those tough decisions, carry the burden, all of those kinds of things. One really important function is alignment. Having made that decision, aligning everybody else in the corporation and its resources to go in that direction. Even though they didn't make the decision, they're going to love going along with you. Can we make that one of the most important parts of leadership?
It's such a great question, and we can go pretty deep on that. I think, alignment at a leadership level, I just want to pick up on a point you raised right towards the end, is this idea of, like, as a leader, you have to say to your leadership team, we can disagree and argue and debate really vehemently about this plan within our team in this meeting now. But when we go out of the room, everybody has to be on board and we have to be fully aligned. You can't have pocket vetoes. You can't have people like muttering to their teams, I disagree with this. That's an explicit leadership signal that you have to send to your team. But I think alignment also has to be operationalized. You have to create systems that ensure alignment. And some of the, my reporting, my approach to leadership is journalistic, and I say it with a small j because I left the New York Times 5 years ago, but the muscles are the same. I learn about leadership through reporting and interviewing, and some of the approaches that I've heard are really relevant to this discussion. So a lot of companies say these are our priorities, right from the top. The problem is that those priorities are often mixed messages. I've talked to a couple of CEOs who to me, it's a really important insight that true priorities come with trade-offs. That if we are going to prioritize this, it's going to be at the expense of that, and acknowledge it. But a lot of CEOs aren't willing to do that because they don't want to say at the expense of something. They want it all. And they leave it to their employees to go like, I don't think that's possible, right? You can't cut costs and then invest in new growth markets. Like, you can't do that. So priorities have to have trade-offs. Another way you create alignment is having people on the leadership team review everybody's plan for the next year. So every leadership team has to be clear about what their colleagues' plan is for the next year and what their respective priorities are. Because problems start once you get into the actual year of execution. People on the leadership team go to the CEO and go, I need this stuff from Joe. Joe's not giving it to me, right? And that's when you start getting tension on the leadership team. You don't get alignment. And I often make the joke, the reason why HBO ran Game of Thrones on Sunday night was to get people ready for work the next day. A lot of leadership teams look like Game of Thrones. There's a zero-sum mindset. And so that's why you need like a system like I just described to make sure that everybody's aligned. It's like, okay, before we go into executing this plan next year, does everybody know what everybody else has to do and where the resources are going? And so this idea of alignment, it's crucial because otherwise you just get these big matrixed organizations that are largely dysfunctional.
Yeah, and the trade-offs are not acknowledged, right? Everybody wants to stay in the previous world where you didn't have to trade off.
Yeah. And given that we're talking economics, I wrote a column a couple of years ago about what I call the dysfunction tax, which is if you could come out with an economic theory or model to measure internal dysfunction in companies, so that of every dollar of revenue that you take in, what percentage of that dollar goes to just covering the bureaucracy and the dysfunction and the ineffective meetings and the blurry reporting lines in an organization? I think at some companies it's pretty high.
Well, I think we've got a synthesis here. We think that capitalism is an entrepreneurial system, not a managerial system, by which we mean you've constantly got to change. You've got to respond to changes in the marketplace and so on. But you do need somebody to, having taken those entrepreneurial decisions, provide you would call it leadership. I'd vote for a word more like guidance to align everybody in the corporation and say, we're all entrepreneurs here. The company is the entrepreneur. We're going to be entrepreneurial, but we're going to do it together.
I agree with that. And just to sort of buttress that point, I referenced this earlier, but I do think that bets might be a better word than strategy, just to send the signal about what the company is doing. Because even big companies, they place bets, right? Strategy implies this like deep diligence and analysis, and you can take the spreadsheet forecasts out 10 columns, 10 years. And the world isn't like that. And you need to encourage risk-taking, not irresponsible risk-taking, but you need to encourage risk-taking and say, hey, folks, we're making a bet here. If it doesn't work, we'll reassess, but this is our bet right now on how we think the world is going, our customers, our clients are going.
Yeah, exactly. Strategy is a bad word because it sounds like a cognitive, deterministic, computer-powered process that, as you say, ends up with 10 columns of numbers that must be right at the end of the year. And that's
exactly
not the way the world works. Are leaders beginning to recognize that?
I think so. I think it's going to be a slow process, but I'm seeing and hearing about more and more companies that realize that, like we sit down like maybe mid-year to start the strategy process for the following year, which we measure progress 18 months later. And by that time, like the world has moved on. I talked to big industrial company, Siemens. They have done away with their traditional performance management system, which is like, okay, we've set the plan at the beginning of the year, and then every quarter we measure, Hunter, your progress against the goals for this plan that we set like last fall. They just realized this is complete theater because the world is changing too fast. So they completely restructured their system and say, okay, these are the 4 pillars that are going to drive our success at the company. And we need to focus on those and have what they call growth conversations between managers and employees about those things. But just this sort of like highly systematized, get the paperwork done, check the boxes, make sure, performance management system that we had before 2020. I just think more companies are realizing, you know what, it's just not the way the world works anymore.
So last question, Adam. I'm going to ask you to think about the future here. There's a concept developing in Chinese companies that they call guided autonomy. And the idea is that the people at the front end, probably in small teams, are totally autonomous. They've given resources and they have to understand their customer and achieve their goals without a lot of management. In fact, they do away with central management. And there's a back end which allocates resources in the big style, which industries are we going to be in and things like that. So guided autonomy, which suggests that there's no management or less management. Will there still be leadership in that world, do you think?
I think there will be, because the way I separate out what you just said is, to me, there's 2 different questions. One is, what are we going to do? And the second question is, how are we going to do it? And I think it's leaders who have to decide what we're going to do. And I don't mean that like at a sort of rigid playbook down to the detail. Figuring out how we're going to do that, can be up to individuals and their teams. Again, pick your metaphor, but I think leaders' job to sort of set the compass, set the direction. We're going to go here, and leave it to others to figure out the roadmap of how we're going to get there. But to me, like, that's the leadership art. And I think the ones that do it successfully, you have to be clear about what good looks like. And this idea of setting direction, setting strategy for a company. The patterns that I've seen is some people, they go at too high an altitude and they start talking about strategy, but they're really just describing what the company does. They're not sort of setting a direction, a plan on how they're going to win in the marketplace. Other people go too low altitude, very tactical, almost like a to-do list level for the next quarter. And so being able to say, this is where we're going, this is how we're going to get there, this is the plan. And ideally, so that to me, the new premium for leaders in this day and age is making the question of strategy, mission, purpose, and values feel very integrated. This is what we're going to do because of who we are and what we believe in. And there can't be gaps in that. They have to feel like Lego pieces that snap really tightly together, rather than just being these sort of disparate conversations. So to me, like, that is the future of effective leadership, is providing that clear direction, letting people figure out how to get there, but making sure that direction incorporates mission, purpose, and values as well as strategy.
Well, it's a beautiful summation. Thank you. Your book is The Leap to Leader. Did I get the title right? It's published when, Adam?
July 11th by Harvard Business Review.
We'll get this podcast out in advance of that. We'll make a link to the book on Amazon and elsewhere. Is there anywhere else we should send them to? Should we send them to your LinkedIn page now?
LinkedIn, my personal website is AdamBryantBooks, all one word.com. And they have links for the books there as well.
Well, the book was brilliant. I loved the sharing of the interviews, which is the source data. I loved the insights that you drew from it. And I loved the structure that you put together. It certainly made me think, as a skeptic about leadership, you've convinced me.
I'll do the touchdown sign here.
That's right, exactly. Good. Adam, thank you so much for today.
I appreciate it. Really appreciate it.
This has been another episode of the Value Creators Podcast. Thanks for listening. You can visit thevaluecreators.com for links and resources related to this episode. And check out hunterhastings.com for more content on entrepreneurial business management based on value creation principles.